Paul McCartney has kept quiet about it for over 50 years. The rumor that he died in 1966 and was replaced by a double. The conspiracy that turned Beatles fans into detectives, searching for clues in song lyrics and album covers. The story that made millions believe one of the world's most famous musicians was actually dead. Now at 82, Paul is finally ready to talk. Not just laugh it off like he used to. Really talk about what it felt like to have the world think you're fake. To have your own children asked if their father is real. This is the story of the strangest rumor in music history. How a simple car accident became a global mystery, and how Paul McCartney learned to live with being the most famous dead man alive. James Paul McCartney was born in Liverpool in 1942, right in the middle of World War II. His dad Jim sold cotton for a living and played piano in pubs at night. His mother Mary delivered babies around the city. They lived in a small house on Forthlin Road with Paul and his younger brother Mike. The family was happy, but not rich. Paul remembers going to bed hungry some nights. His clothes were hand-me-downs from neighbors, but there was always music in the house. Jim would play old songs on the piano, and Paul would sing along. Then the worst thing happened. When Paul was 14, his mother got sick with breast cancer. In 1956, there wasn't much doctors could do. Mary McCartney died on October 31st. Paul came home from school and found his dad crying in the kitchen. Everything fell apart. Jim couldn't handle the house payments and raising two boys alone. They moved to a smaller place. Paul watched his dad struggle to keep food on the table. Some nights, Jim would just stare at the wall, too sad to speak. Paul threw himself into music. He saved up and bought a cheap guitar that cut his fingers when he played. He practiced for hours in his tiny bedroom, learning songs from the radio. Music was the only thing that made the pain go away. On July 6, 1957, Paul went to a church fair in Liverpool. A teenage band called the Quarrymen was playing. Their leader was John Lennon, a tough 17-year-old with thick glasses and a smart mouth. Paul watched John perform and knew he had to be in that band. After the show, Paul picked up a guitar and played 20 Flight Rock perfectly. John tried to act like he didn't care, but he was impressed. 2 weeks later, John asked Paul to join the Quarrymen. That handshake in a church hall would change music forever. The next few years were brutal. They played in dirty clubs in Hamburg, Germany. Drunks threw bottles at them. They slept in tiny rooms behind movie theaters with no heat. They ate almost nothing and got sick constantly. Paul lost 20 pounds and looked like a skeleton. Back in England, every record company said no. Guitar music is finished, one executive told them. Find real jobs. Paul wanted to quit 100 times, but something kept pushing him forward. Maybe it was his mother's memory. Maybe it was pure stubbornness. On October 5th, 1962, the Beatles released Love Me Do. It was mostly Paul's song, with his harmonica carrying the melody. The record slowly climbed to number 17 on the British charts. Not huge, but it was a start. The real breakthrough came on February 9th, 1964. The Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in New York. Paul stood on the left side of the stage. His bass guitar hung low, his hair falling into his eyes. When the curtain opened, he could see the audience, but couldn't hear them over the screaming. 73 million Americans watched that night, almost half the country. When Paul sang the high parts on I Wanna Hold Your Hand, teenage girls fainted in the theater. The sound was so loud that the audio equipment couldn't handle it. The next week, the Beatles had the top 5 songs in America. Paul couldn't believe it. 2 years earlier, he was playing for drunk sailors in Hamburg. Now he was the most famous bass player in the world. The press called him the cute Beatle. Reporters always asked about his hair, his girlfriends, and what he ate for breakfast. Paul learned to smile and give them what they wanted. But behind the charm, he was the band's engine. He pushed the others to practice more, write better songs, and try new ideas. Paul was our business manager, our musical director, and our biggest fan all rolled into one. John Lennon said years later, "Without him, we would have given up after Hamburg." The fan mail started pouring in. Thousands of letters every day, mostly for Paul. Girls camping outside his house in London. Police escorts everywhere he went. Paul loved the attention at first, but it quickly became a prison. From 1963 to 1966, the Beatles owned the world. They released 6 albums that all went to number 1. Paul wrote classics like Yesterday, Michelle, and Hey Jude. He sang lead vocals on most of their biggest hits. The concerts were insane. At Shea Stadium in New York, 55,000 fans screamed so loud that Paul couldn't hear his own bass guitar. Girls threw themselves at the stage. Police formed human walls to keep fans from rushing the band. Paul both loved and hated it. He enjoyed being famous, but he missed having a normal life. He couldn't go to a restaurant without causing a riot. He couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. Even his family couldn't visit him without being followed by photographers. The other Beatles were getting tired of it too. John was becoming more political and angry. George wanted more of his songs on the albums. Ringo felt left out of the creative process. They were four friends trapped in a bubble of fame. In August 1966, the Beatles played their last concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They didn't tell anyone it was the end. They just walked off stage and never performed together in public again. Paul suggested they focus on making better records instead of touring. They couldn't hear their music over the screaming anyway. This decision probably saved their creativity, but it also made them more mysterious to their fans. When people couldn't see the Beatles in person anymore, they started looking for them in other ways. They studied every album cover like it was a puzzle. They played songs backwards looking for hidden messages. They analyzed every photo for clues about what the band was really thinking. This obsession with Beatles mysteries would soon create the biggest rumor of Paul's life. By late 1966, the Beatles were falling apart. John was getting into drugs and avant-garde art with his girlfriend Yoko Ono. George was studying Indian music and meditation. Ringo was thinking about becoming an actor, and Paul was desperately trying to keep the band together. On November 9, 1966, Paul crashed his scooter on a rainy London street. He wasn't going fast, but he hit the pavement hard and split his lip open. Blood was everywhere. He went to the hospital, got stitches, and went home to recover. Paul didn't want to be photographed with a busted face, so he stayed inside for several weeks. He grew a mustache to cover the scar and avoided all public appearances. To him, it was no big deal. He had a small accident and needed time to heal. But to Beatles fans, Paul McCartney disappearing was huge news. Where was he? Why wasn't he doing interviews? Why did the other Beatles look sad in recent photos? On October 12, 1969, a college student named Tom Zarsky called into WKNR radio in Detroit. He claimed Paul McCartney had died in a car crash on November 9, 1966. He said the Beatles replaced him with a lookalike named William Campbell to avoid breaking up the band. The radio DJ, Russ Gibb, was skeptical at first, but when he started looking for evidence, he found things that seemed to support the theory. Play Revolution 9 backwards. And it sounds like Turn Me On, Dead Man. Look at the Abbey Road album cover, and Paul is out of step with the others. Within days, the story exploded across America. College students stayed up all night playing Beatles records backwards. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the clues. Radio stations held Paul is Dead marathons, playing supposed evidence for hours. Paul was shocked. He had grown a mustache and stayed home for a few weeks, and now millions of people thought he was dead. The other Beatles found it funny at first, but the rumors got darker and more elaborate. Some fans claimed the fake Paul was part of a government cover-up. Others connected his supposed death to the Kennedy assassination and other conspiracies. Paul realized this wasn't just a silly rumor, it was becoming a dangerous obsession. For 3 years, Paul mostly ignored the death rumors. He figured they would fade away if he didn't give them attention. The Beatles broke up in 1970, and Paul started a solo career. He thought people would move on to new obsessions, but the rumors kept growing. By 1969, Life magazine decided to track Paul down and get the truth. They found him at his farm in Scotland, chopping wood with his wife Linda and their children. He looked annoyed, but agreed to pose for photos. "The rumor of my death has been greatly exaggerated," Paul told the reporter, borrowing a famous line from Mark Twain. "Do I look dead? I'm very much alive. Thank you." But even this wasn't enough for the conspiracy believers. They claimed the photos were doctored. They said the real Paul would never live on a farm or grow a beard. Some even hired handwriting experts to prove that Paul's signature was different after 1966. Paul tried using humor to kill the story. When reporters asked if he was dead, he would say, "If I were dead, would I tell you?" He thought jokes might make people realize how silly the whole thing was. Instead, his jokes made things worse. Conspiracy fans said his humor proved he was hiding something. They analyzed every word he said for secret meanings. Paul realized he was trapped. Anything he said or did would be seen as evidence for or against the theory. The breaking point came in the 2020s, more than 50 years after the rumors started. Paul was doing interviews to promote his latest album when hosts kept bringing up the death conspiracy. Instead of laughing it off like usual, Paul got serious. "You know what? It hurt," he said quietly during one podcast interview. "People calling my house, asking my wife if I was really me. My kids hearing these stories at school. It stopped being funny a long time ago." That moment changed everything. Paul decided it was time to tell his complete story, not just dismiss the rumors with jokes. Today, Paul McCartney is 82 years old and still performing sold-out concerts around the world. He's outlived John Lennon, who was murdered by a fan in 1980, and George Harrison, who died of cancer in 2001. Only he and Ringo Starr are left from the most famous band in history. Paul has been married twice. His first wife, Linda, died of breast cancer in 1998 after 29 years of marriage. In 2011, he married Nancy Shevell, an American businesswoman. He has 5 children and 8 grandchildren. His entire family has had to deal with the death conspiracy their whole lives. "My daughter Stella used to come home from school crying," Paul revealed in a recent interview. "Kids would tell her that her dad was fake, that the real Paul McCartney was dead. She was 8 years old. How do you explain that to a child?" Linda McCartney was Paul's fiercest defender against the conspiracy theories. She would get angry with reporters who asked about them. "He's my husband," she would snap. "I think I would know if he was dead." After Linda died, Paul said losing her was like losing half of himself. The death rumors have gotten worse with the internet. YouTube videos claiming to prove Paul died have millions of views. Facebook groups devoted to the conspiracy have thousands of members. New evidence appears online, everyday photos, supposedly showing differences in Paul's face, voice analysis claiming he sounds different, even scientific studies of his ear shape. Paul admits the constant questions about his identity have affected him more than he let on for decades. "There's something deep down that hurts when people say you're not real," he explains, "like your whole life doesn't matter, like the music you made doesn't count." But he's found peace in his work and family. He still writes songs every day, still tours to arenas full of fans who sing every word. At 82, he can still hit the high notes on Yesterday and make crowds of 50,000 people feel like they're in their living room. His voice has gotten rougher with age, but his bass playing is still perfect. He can still remember the words to hundreds of Beatles songs. Most remarkably, he can still enjoy performing them, even after playing Hey Jude thousands of times. "I'm grateful to be alive and making music," Paul says now, even if some people refuse to believe it. The Paul is dead conspiracy became the blueprint for every wild theory that followed. It showed how people could find evidence for anything if they looked hard enough. It predicted our current age of fake news and social media rumors spreading faster than truth. Music historians call it the first viral conspiracy theory. It spread from radio DJs to college newspapers to mainstream television, all without the internet. If a story that crazy could fool millions of people in 1969, imagine what could happen today. But Paul's real legacy has nothing to do with death rumors. He wrote or co-wrote 32 #1 hits, more than any songwriter in history. Songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Maybe I'm Amazed have been covered by thousands of artists and heard by billions of people. Other musicians still study Paul's techniques. Taylor Swift calls him her biggest influence. Kanye West sampled Yesterday on one of his hits. The surviving members of Queen say Paul taught them how to write perfect pop songs. Even hip-hop producers sample his bass lines. Paul has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the Beatles and once as a solo artist. Queen Elizabeth knighted him in 1997. He's won 18 Grammy Awards and sold over 100 million albums on his own, separate from Beatles sales. More importantly, he survived. While John was killed by an obsessed fan and George died too young from cancer, Paul found a way to keep creating and connecting with audiences. The death conspiracy couldn't kill his spirit or his love for music. Paul proved that real talent beats fake rumors every time, says Beatles historian Mark Lewison. His songs will be remembered long after people forget about the conspiracy theories. The strangest part of Paul's legacy might be that he's become more famous for supposedly being dead than many musicians are for being alive. Google searches for Paul is dead still outnumber searches for most current pop stars. Paul McCartney has now spent more of his life dealing with death rumors than he spent as a Beatle. The Beatles lasted 10 years. The conspiracy theory has followed him for over 50 years and shows no signs of stopping. I used to get angry about it, Paul reflects. Then I felt sorry for the people who believed it. Now I understand that some people need mysteries more than they need music. That's human nature, I suppose. The Paul is Dead story reveals something deep about how we relate to our heroes. We want them to be more complicated than they really are. We want secrets and hidden meanings. Sometimes a car accident is just an accident, and a mustache is just a way to cover a scar. Paul's message to the conspiracy believers is simple but profound. I'm here. I'm real. I'm still making music. Isn't that enough? But he knows it won't be enough for everyone. As long as there are Beatles fans, there will be people who think Paul McCartney died in 1966. Maybe that's okay. Every legend needs a mystery to keep people interested. Paul has given us incredible music, unforgettable performances, and one of the strangest stories in entertainment history. He's also given us something rarer, an example of how to handle fame with grace. For over 50 years, people have questioned his very existence. He could have become bitter or stopped performing. Instead, he kept writing beautiful songs and treating his fans with kindness. The real miracle isn't that Paul McCartney survived a car crash in 1966. The miracle is that at 82, he's still here, still creating, still finding joy in music after everything he's been through. The conspiracy theorists can keep looking for clues. The rest of us can just listen to the songs and be grateful that Paul McCartney, the real Paul McCartney, is still alive and still making the world a little more beautiful with his music. Paul McCartney never died. He lived, worked, loved, and kept writing songs that touched the world. Yet the rumor that claimed otherwise became a piece of pop culture that will likely never disappear. His story reminds us that legends often carry shadows. Fame can create myths that take on a life of their own. But in the end, the truth is simple. Paul McCartney has always been here, living his life in full view of the world. And perhaps the bigger question is not whether Paul was ever gone, but how one man's music has made generations feel so alive. In the end, that's all any of us can ask for, to create something meaningful and to still be here to enjoy it. Paul McCartney has done both, and that's the only evidence that really matters. Paul McCartney's story has always been surrounded by music, fame, and one of the strangest rumors in rock history, the idea that he secretly died in the 1960s and was replaced by a double. The Beatles had already lived through poverty, rejection, and endless nights in small clubs before they became the biggest band in the world, and Paul's rise from his working-class Liverpool childhood to global stardom seemed like the kind of dream that could never be shaken. Yet at the very height of the Beatles' fame, while Paul was writing timeless songs like Yesterday and Hey Jude, people began whispering that he'd been killed in a car crash in 1966. The rumor exploded when fans claimed to find clues in album covers and in the lyrics of songs, pointing to Paul being barefoot on the Abbey Road cover, or hearing strange words when they played records backwards. In truth, Paul was alive the entire time, living with his wife Linda on their farm in Scotland, but the myth took on a life of its own, fueled by the growing obsession with the Beatles and the way their every move seemed to hide a mystery. Paul later admitted that the story was both frustrating and oddly flattering, since it showed just how carefully fans listened to his work. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, Paul was unfairly blamed by some fans, yet he proved himself again by forming Wings and releasing hits like Band on the Run and Live and Let Die, showing he could succeed outside the Beatles' shadow. Over the years, he adapted to new musical eras, collaborating with Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, and even keeping his solo career active into his 80s, with tours that still filled stadiums. His personal life was marked by deep love and loss, especially the death of Linda McCartney in 1998, but he continued forward, raising his family and even finding new love later in life. Through it all, the rumor of his supposed death followed him, often popping up in interviews and documentaries, and Paul learned to laugh about it, once joking that the rumor of my death was greatly exaggerated. Today, his legacy is not the strange story about a fake Paul, but the truth of his music, which changed the world, inspired countless artists, and continues to reach new generations. The Paul is Dead tale is mostly rumor, a piece of pop culture folklore that says more about how much people cared about the Beatles than about Paul himself. It shows how fame can blur the line between fact and fantasy, and how myths grow when people want to believe there is a deeper secret hiding in the art they love. In the end, Paul McCartney never died. He kept writing, kept singing, and kept living. While the rumor that haunted him for decades turned into one of the most famous stories in rock history, remembered today as a curious legend rather than a fact.